Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Office Hours with Jess. Today, I will be talking about grant funding and research, and specifically relating this back to my own grant application experience. Our learning objectives for today are to discuss first how to find grants or how I find grants, my grant writing experience, and then walking through essentially from start to finish the grant funding process, challenges that I find in the grant writing process. So, first, I want to talk about how and where you search for grants. But before jumping into even just searching for them, just what types of grants and who funds them, I do want to say that this is not a comprehensive talk of like all the grants out there. And this is very specific to research. There's also a lot of grants out there in the nonprofit world, but this is mostly what I come across in as a researcher myself. So there are federal grants, for example, like the NIH. There's also foundation grants from organizations like the American Cancer Society, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and also a lot of institutions and schools will have internal grants that are just meant for people who are students, staff, faculty to apply for those grants, and they're internal. There are different types of grants or categories of grants, and these are sort of what I've bucketed as the main ones that I've mostly come across. The first one is research project grants. So this is kind of your, typical R01 from NIH. It funds not just, some or most of your salary as a researcher, but you can hire other research assistants, other study team members. It funds all of your research equipment and supplies. So really just everything that you might need to carry out an entire research project. There are also career development awards. These are specific to people in training and most specifically like postdocs, really, but these are generally mentored. So, even though you are the primary investigator for that grant, you'll need to have some sort of mentor or mentoring team to guide you through. And these can range from, providing you with your salary all the way up to, again, the full research project funds. Kind of similar to this is that there are also fellowships. These are also meant for students or people in training and postdocs like me. But this more specifically just pays for your salary because it's meant to say like, okay, we'll support you in your training, but not necessarily to carry out like all of your different research projects. And then pilot grants, these are sort of smaller buckets of money, but meant to sort of jumpstart you so that you can collect data to then work towards applying for a larger research project grant. Where do I find grants? To be honest, I just use Google and sometimes just to search for. I mean, I mainly go to the NIH to be honest, but I go to Google just to look up different foundations in my field that have grants. So Google has been a great place, honestly, for me to search around. I mainly hear about grants by just talking to my other mentors or colleagues in the field and asking where they have applied for grants and successfully applied for grants. And that's been the most successful for me. At all the institutions I've been, there's been a whole office of, full-time staff of people who work to, manage grants. And they also know a lot about what grants are out there to apply for. And it's also great to kind of just keep an eye out if you're on any professional groups listservs. I sometimes just get forwarded information, whether from my internal grants office or just a listserv from a different organization, like, hey, there's this call for applications for this grant. And sometimes it has nothing to do with my work. Sometimes it might have a little bit to do. So you just never know what you might find. So just keep an eye out on those kinds of emails. Now I want to dive into my own grant application experience and what it's been like for me to apply to grants. So I have applied to quite a few grants in the past couple of years, and I've listed them all here, and I'm not going to read them off. And the reason why I list things here is to kind of make a little point, which you'll see in a moment. But these are the grants that I've applied to in my entire career. So my first grant I ever applied to was an F31, which was a pre-doctoral fellowship grant from the NIH that I applied for when I was a third year in my PhD program. And then since then have just sort of really been trying to apply to as many grants as possible as a postdoc, as you can see here. But the reason why I list everything here is because I want to show you this next slide. So everything in red means I did not get the grant. Everything in yellow is that I'm still waiting, so you can see all the more recent grants I've submitted. And the one grant in green, the one pilot grant from Stanford, is the one and only grant that I have gotten thus far. And the reason why I say this is to just show that applying for grants is not necessarily just this easy process that, like I can just churn them out and that's why I've applied to so many. It's because it's persistence and understanding that it takes many, many, many resubmissions before you get to that grant that is going to be funded. And it's been a very tough journey for someone like me, as you all know, who is very, very impatient and wants efficiency. It's so hard to keep submitting these grants because it takes so long for them to get reviewed, only for me to have to resubmit and keep waiting and waiting and waiting. So it has been a lot for me myself to learn how to ride this grant roller coaster. I always tell myself that failure is success in progress. As cheesy as it sounds, it really is true. Every time your grant gets reviewed, you get comments back. So whether it's funded or not, you get feedback, and that feedback helps you with whatever next grant you submit. So it's always sort of a win in that sense of like you're always becoming better. Every grant, you learn something and you can just keep moving forward. So despite everything, you just keep submitting and having faith that, it takes a lot of failed grants for everyone in order to get to that one that is finally funded. And no one ever talks about kind of all the failure that they go through. So I really want to highlight that here. And that's been something really hard for me to really embody with this quote that you see here, because it's really goes against my, again, need for efficiency and wanting to keep moving things forward. But it is just about persistence and continually submitting, even when you feel like you don't want to anymore. Now on to the grant process. So I want to now talk a little bit about sort of what it's like to submit a grant from start to finish and what that generally looks like. Again, this is super high level, but wanted to just give a little taste of sort of what the steps are. So first, of course, you want to find which grant you want. And I kind of discussed this earlier already. Talk to your mentors, use the internet, figure out what grant it is. And then generally, you want to prepare about 3 to 6 months in advance, depending on what kind of grant it is. I would say that that is a very optimistic time to start preparing for grants. I know a lot of people who do this in much less time and they still get things funded. But ideally, the earlier you start, the better. So I always aim to try to prepare 3 to 6 months in advance. And another important thing is make sure that you meet any and all requirements of these grants. Sometimes, especially as a postdoc, there are like, in these fellowship grants, they have these really specific, like you can only have been a postdoc for X number of months. And then if you don't meet those like exact criteria, they won't even look at your grant. So make sure you meet any and all requirements and that you are eligible to apply for it. Once you've identified the grant, then you want to come up with your grant idea. And that's going to be your key aims or your specific aims of your grant or your study or whatever it is you're proposing. Think about the work you're doing, what work you've previously done that might inform this. Brainstorm with your mentor, your team, and make sure that it is a unique idea. You can't just, you saw that long list of grants on my other page. It's not like I just took one idea and literally submitted the same grant 10 times. Like if you submit, you want to make sure it's at least a little bit unique than your previous submissions. And like I said, if you do have a previous grant submission or previous study that can help inform this current grant, that's even better. Once you figured out what you want to write the grant on, then you write and submit it. Oftentimes you can work with you must, at least in my case, you must work with your institution's grant office and staff. Oftentimes they're actually even the ones that submit the grant for you on the portal, like that the grant submission is. I've never actually been the one to hit the submit button. So I would figure out with your institution exactly what their internal process is, and they have their internal guidelines as well. So again, earlier the better. Part of the grant is not just writing the grant, but also coming up with the budget. And that's something that your grants office or your grants staff at your institution might be able to help you with. You want to make sure the instructions are exactly followed. Even if the margins are off by like zero point zero 0.01, they won't even read your grant sometimes. So it's better safe than sorry. Make sure all the instructions are exactly followed because you don't want your grant to be disqualified because of something like that. And this has happened to me before and it is heartbreaking. So make sure you follow all the instructions, formatting, everything. Do not wait until the last minute. You don't want to be the one, sweating when it's a couple minutes before the deadline and the portal for some reason isn't working or you're missing a form and you have to like come up with it last minute. I've had this happen before where my grants office was like reviewing my submission and then literally like the day before they were like, we need this thing. And I had to like last minute ask one of my mentors for a document. I was like, I hope my mentor's like not busy or on vacation. Like I'm asking for this like kind of big thing a couple days, before it's due. So you never know what can happen. So the earlier you just get things done, the better. It's also important to get people to review your grant and read it so that it is a strong application. I always actually even like to have people that don't know anything about my study or they're not as like working as closely with my grant to read it because I want an outsider to be able to read my grant and like have it make sense. Because when you're just reading your own grant over and over, it makes sense to you because you wrote it so much. You want to make sure an outsider reads it and also gets it too. So my husband is sort of my designated that person, which is I'm giving you credit now. And he also helps me just like proofread everything too, because it's also hard to catch those little typos when you've been staring at the same, Word document for like months. So get people to read your grant and make sure you proofread it. Then once you submit, you can breathe a sigh of relief. That's congratulate, celebrate that because that's huge in and of itself, just to submit a grant. So I should have put a slide in here to just celebrate that you submitted the grant. But then you have to wait for the review or the score, and that can take anywhere between 3 and 6 months. So it takes a long time. Be patient and work on other things in the meantime to just distract yourself and keep your other research moving along. And then, once those many months have passed, you'll get your score or your decision. So sometimes you'll get like a score, and things are scored completely differently based on different organizations and groups. Based on that score, then they'll sort of rank the applications and then determine, okay, this is where we cut it off, and everyone who got a score, in this range will get funded. That's how some places do it. That's how the NIH does it. Some places will just not score you and straight up be like, you're being funded, yes, no, or sometimes in rare cases, even waitlisted. You'll always get comments regardless if your grant is funded or not, and you'll want to respond to those comments if you are resubmitting it. So those are really helpful, no matter what the outcome is. So, you'll get your comments and you'll start planning for your resubmission based on those comments, or you'll get your notice of award, which means you're funded. So that will give you the start date of the award and any other details that you need moving forward. Post award, you'll obviously need to carry out your project, and then based on sort of their frequency, they'll tell you how often, your funder will tell you how often they want progress reports. So it can be every 6 months, 1 year. It really depends on the award, but you must do these. There are some places that will even pull your funding if you accidentally don't turn one in or turn one in on time. So these are important because the funders want to make sure that you are keeping up with the work so that they keep funding your project. Generally, there will be some kind of program officer from the funding organization or the funding source that will be there to be your contact person and support you so you're not just kind of floating on your own. And again, you just want to make sure that you are adhering to your study timeline that you do propose in your grant application. And that's what you're showing, throughout your progress reports after. And then finally, once you've completed or when you're getting close to, or if you've completed your study that your grant or whatever work that you've done while being funded on this grant, you want to disseminate your finding. That's so important. So publish manuscripts, present at conferences, give community talks, create flyers or infographics that you can disseminate to the community so that, again, it's not just for like a research audience, but for the community as well. Okay. So that's a little bit about the grant process and a little bit about challenges that I've found, which I've already hinted at, but just want to reiterate again. Some of the biggest challenges or hurdles that I've come across. First one is that the system is very unforgiving. I've already brought this up in terms of making those like small little margin mistakes or little formatting errors. I've had a grant misclassified, and that was probably one of the lowest points in my academic career. Story for another time, or if you're interested, leave it in the comments. But just know that I really mean it when I say they sometimes will absolutely not review your application, even if one tiny, tiny thing is wrong. My second point I've already mentioned too, it often takes many resubmissions before a grant is funded, but this is normal. It's unfortunate that this is the case and that it is so tough, but that's just what it is. So persistence and patience are key. The two things I'm pretty persistent, but I'm not patient. So two things that I'm working on still. And my second point to that is also just don't be afraid to just submit and try. That's why I've submitted so many grants because I'm just like, I understand that at some point this kind of becomes a numbers game of like, if it takes so many resubmissions, like I want to be submitting as much as possible, getting feedback and becoming a better researcher myself. So, and you never know, you could submit something and they could love your idea. So just go for it. Finally, it is a very competitive space because of, like I said, it takes so many resubmissions before a grant is funded. So there's a lot of pressure to come up with innovative ideas. But what I found is that collaborating helps. And when you come up with this amazing interdisciplinary team of people who are going to bring their different strengths to your grant, it makes it a lot stronger. So that's why you see, grants where the PIs or all the study team members are from different organizations or different institutions because it shows that there's this collaboration and people are bringing their expertise in. And with that, I want to thank you all. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you on another episode of Office Hours with Jess. Thank you.